Friends and colleagues, it's my pleasure to invite another of our partners from the United Kingdom to the lectern, Dr. Hugh Davies. Hugh is at present the Director of Education and Online Development at King's College Department of Defence Studies and Head of Online Programs at King's Institute of Applied Security Studies. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks, Craig, and it's a real pleasure to be here today for the launch of the Security and Defence Plus partnership and for the Advancing AUKUS conference. In addition to the roles that Craig mentioned, I've recently been appointed the Associate Dean for Executive, Professional and Online Education at the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy at King's College London. That mouthful of a job title means that I'm responsible for the development of new executive education offerings from the faculty. Kim Beasley earlier on argued that a truly massive smartening up is required for the AUKUS nations. Well, I guess we can help with that. So besides chairing this panel, I'm here to discuss the sort of continuing and professional and executive education interventions that the Security and Defence Partnership can provide. To that end, then, feel free to bend my ear over coffee or dinner later on. For now, though, it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for this panel entitled Unpicking the Gordian Knot, How to Get Answers to the Big Questions of AUKUS. Our first speaker is Dale Ormond, who serves as the Chief Engineer for MITRE DoD Chief Information Officer and the Defence Information Service Agency portfolio, where he oversees the technical work, planning, execution and quality of the MITRE work. Prior to joining MITRE in September 2018, he served as the Director for Science and Technology in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defence for Research and Engineering. During an extensive and varied career, Mr. Ormond has also served as the first civilian director of the US Army Research, Engineering and Development Command and the first two-star civilian equivalent deputy to the Chief Commanding General at the US Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth. Mr. Ormond graduated from the United States Naval Academy with distinction and served in uniform as a nuclear qualified submariner and naval intelligence officer. Our second speaker is Dr. Lesley Seebeck, who is an independent consultant, honorary professor at the Australian National University and chair of the National Institute of Strategic Resilience. She headed the Cyber Institute at the ANU through to 2020, has held senior executive roles in the federal government and has extensive experience in strategy, policy, defence, intelligence, budget, information technology and research roles in government, industry and academia. In 2017, she was recognised as Federal Government CIO of the Year. Dr. Seebeck has a PhD in Information Technology, an MBA, a Master's in Defence Studies, a Bachelor's in Applied Science, and is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. I'd like to invite our first speaker to make his remarks.
Well, it's great to be here with you today and talk a little bit about, I've been asked to talk about the FFRDC's concept that the U.S. employs to support the Department of Defense and many of our federal agencies. And FFRDC is a federally funded research and development center that works only for government agencies. And in the context of AUKUS, I'd like to provide a little bit of a sea story to give you a sense of what we view this as challenges and how you might think about it. I got a chance a number of years ago to do a staff ride at Normandy, which is staff rides. You go walk the beaches with historians, and really quite fascinating. The summation of it was really kind of, in one sense, one of the last big peer-on-peer kinds of conflicts where you had defense and offense. And a couple of things to think about. Eisenhower spent 5 years planning the Normandy invasion. The technology during that 5 years did not change. Air bombardment, sea bombardment, landing craft on the offense, on the defense, impediments on the beach, pillboxes with 50 cal, and artillery lined up at the eastern end of the beach to just annihilate everybody who came ashore. In the execution of the fight, two things really kind of changed the battle. One, a commando team climbed up a significant, up on top of the cliff under fire and took out all the artillery and shut it all down. The second thing happened was a platoon its boat got confused, the navigator, and they landed 400 yards to the east of Omaha Beach in a really lousy place to land. It was relatively undefended, and the platoon commander fought his way up the side of the hill, and he is the one that came behind and started taking out the pillboxes that allowed the invasion force to actually get ashore. Without those two things, Normandy could have been quite a bit of a disaster for the U.S. and for all the Allies. But what my conversation here is that offensive operations against an entrenched defense is really, really hard. And what's happened over the last 20 years is the Western nations, especially Iraq and Afghanistan, what you saw was a huge technological advantage over the adversary, able to carry the day against a significantly larger force because of the huge technological advantage. In a peer fight, where the technological advantage is very much the same, if you don't show up with a lot more mass, your chances of being successful are pretty small. It's the old game of risk. So what we look at this, when I talk about this in terms of a potential fight with one of our potential adversaries, the only way we're going to get more mass from the West is an integrated, interchangeable force that shows up on the first day ready to fight. And that is integration of command and control, integration of common operating picture, integration of fires, integration of electronic warfare systems, the management and execution of the electromagnetic spectrum. If all those things aren't aligned well, because the next fight is going to be 5 domains: air, land, sea, space, and cyber, all simultaneously. So you can give you a sense of the complexity, the complexity of the fight, and what kind of complexity, and breaking that complexity down into bite-sized chunks that allows solutions to be developed to solve individual problems while integrating them simultaneously so you can get after that, is the challenge I would offer for AUKUS. For actually going to take AUKUS to the ultimate end. And what we see from Ms. Hsu is she's really asking the department to look at where are some technologies that we can mature and create capabilities within the next couple of years to demonstrate some of this success so that we can push for greater success as we move out. So what is an FFRDC? Really gets after what we are, and I'll just give an example of the company I work for, the MITRE Corporation. We are a systems engineering FFRDC. We have research FFRDCs, and we have studies FFRDCs. MITRE is the systems engineering FFRDC, really spends his time working on integrating systems, integrating capabilities to produce, integrating technologies to produce capabilities that can be fielded. Works with the government. We work with the government to mitigate risk. Here's the sets of challenges you have. How do we break those down in a way that can be understood? How do we understand where the risk is? Where are the technology challenges? How can you put together good specifications? And what the FFRDCs do for the government is allow them to bring the technical expertise that exists in the commercial world and put it on the side of the government with special access to help the government make better decisions. It is not in competition with the labs. It's not in competition with the acquisition. It's not in competition with the commercial providers. It sits in a unique spot to help the government make better decisions faster so that it can address the most profound gaps and really does bring the technical expertise, breaking down the sets of challenges and allowing the government to understand those so they can make the decisions that they have to make in the context of the government decision-making process. So a couple of things about an FFRDC that makes it relatively unique. It is a not-for-profit. So there's no vested interest in the future contracts in the sense of I sell a widget and then I want to upgrade, the government wants to upgrade the widget, and so I have that essentially sole source contract for the future. It is technically disinterested in the interest of disinterested in the decision the government makes largely. Obviously it makes recommendations on what the government should consider, but it really is the government's choice, and the FFRDCs help to support this. And so these are the kinds of things that it's a bit of a unique, as far as we can understand, it is not a construct that exists in the Australian sets of laws. It obviously, except in the U.S. has like 47 FFRDCs that go across different things, and they all have largely different capabilities and expertise, so the government uses them as appropriate. There is some indication that the Brits have a similar kind of process to some degree. But was asked to come talk about this as Australia and the UK start to think about how do they want to work across the countries, how do they want to make sure that they understand the technical implications of decisions and try to set themselves up for the most success in making the most important investments to get after the right capabilities to solve the most important gaps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I feel as though a lot of what I was going to say has already been said by a number of previous speakers. So we're going to tackle the problem of the Gordian knot. Now, if anyone knows, I'm sure Peter does, given his background, the myth of the Gordian knot, you don't untangle it, you slice it. However, that implies a degree of both precision and strength that I think is going to be sort of challenging to us as we start thinking about AUKUS. For a start, when we start thinking about what is AUKUS, we end up, I went back and sort of said, okay, what does each country think about what the purpose is? Because even if we start doing something, it's got to be to some particular end. And you realise immediately that there are divergent purposes. The United States, for example, its big strategic issue about strategic signalling in the region, sending out the signal and providing a focus around the technological competition, which is of deep concern. In the UK, a lot of the literature that was written about it afterwards focused on the economic benefits. And again, you get that sense of global Britain. So the US is saying, okay, we can signal the region, we can help the UK find its global role, we can focus on technology. And then there's Australia. And certainly I was asked not long after it came out, by someone from fairly senior in Washington, so why did Australia push this so hard on the US? Well, for Australia, there is very much the ties that bind. There is that sense, overcoming that sense of abandonment is still very strong. It gets us into an even more exclusive club, that nuclear propulsion club. But more importantly, it actually makes up for the shortfall that we all know we have in that technology industrial capability. We've been falling backwards. And I quite agree with Kim's comment earlier that we have the most to stand to benefit from AUKUS. It also means we have to do a lot more of the heavy lifting, as Joe Hockey was pointing out as well. But we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of the task. When we look at the means, the levels of complexity in each of these different areas are magnified, orders of magnitude much more than the simple task of trying to reform defence, for example, and we know how hard that is. Trying to sort out the procurement system in defence is another issue. We've been struggling with innovation defence for many years. And then there's a whole change of defence posture. And I think, Kim, if we actually gave defence anywhere between $8 and another $18 billion, we wouldn't see a new defence, we'd just see more of the same, more tanks in particular. The technology wavefront itself, is, even though we've selected areas, is very broad and it's changing. It is dynamic and it changes at different pace. There's a range of different drivers. The production function in each is quite different. And then there's another area of complexity, and that is dealing with the private sector academics across 3 allies and reaching out to those allies and partners we'd like to engage, such as Japan. So that's a major issue. Well, it's not a small problem. And Australia being the weakest partner, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Observatory of Economic Complexity. It is put together by Cesar Hidalgo at MIT. And his argument is that we shouldn't be looking at GDP when we look at economic power. We should be looking at knowledge production and knowledge content of products and services. And he went back and looked at what that content is. And there's a really neat diagram on the website. If you're on the left-hand side, because it correlates with prosperity, if you're on the left-hand side of this particular diagram, there's an axis that runs through the middle, you're going backwards, decreasing in knowledge production, knowledge content, etc. If you're on the right-hand side, increasing. And of course, the level of prosperity crosses over. So up at the top right, of course, we find Switzerland, We find Singapore, Germany, South Korea, United States, of course, is up there. China, of course, is growing, as we'd expect. Where do you think Australia is? We're on the left. We're going backwards. When he first did this, we were ranked about number 33. We're now ranked number 90. So we have a lot of ground to pick up, and that means major, significant systemic reforms. So I'm going to offer some thoughts about what to do, because we need to build a system of innovation. And I'll take Joe's point too. Again, it's not just, it is the money, but it's not just the money. It's how we do this and how we think about this. We need to have a means of prioritisation, because we can't do everything at once. Even those areas we identified, as I said, they've got different dynamics behind them at different timeframes, different needs. We also need to probably pull apart that thing about technology development and actually the translation into military capability. They're not the same thing. There's going to, and precisely because we need to think about things such as doctrine, integration into defence forces, into our defence posture, how it is, what the adversary looks like, where it's going to be applied, those sort of things. So these are different things. And what that means is that really that technology development is really firmly based on the civilian side, which is where that commercial side comes in, but also academics, etc. It's firmly based on the civilian side of the house. So let's think about the means of production. All technologies are not the same. The way I tend to think about it is that we need to break these things up by what I call use cases, frontier technology, and general purpose technologies. The use cases is actually applying things in the field. So when Peter Khalil was talking earlier, he's saying we need to do things now. Great. There's a lot there we can field now. We can put into the field and we learn. We need to have that fast adaptation cycle, because what we learn there, we will actually be able to sort of apply elsewhere. And you can do this in a range of different areas. I mean, things like cyber and AI lend themselves particularly to that, but things like such as automation is another one. And that could be undersea automation. It's a range of things there. We want to put things in the field. So we want to have that real experimentation capability. Then there's a frontier, and this is where you've got your moonshots. These are the things where you need to build, as Michelle was saying before, you're talking about 20, 25 years before you're getting even to the prototype stage. But you need to start things now. So we need to do the thinking now about what is that really at that edge there that we need to start investing now, and we need to build that capability. It takes 7 years to just season an engineer. So you've got 4 years of training to get their engineering degree. You've got then a master's and probably another year just to get the feet under the table and get them used to the environment. That's 7 years. So we start thinking about 7 years. To do a PhD, a postdoc, that's 10 to 12 to 15 years. So what's down the track? But not only that, those frontier sort of projects are important because these are the things that excite people. They're also the ones that can sustain that development of that long-term capability. So those are those two things we need to start thinking about how we structure these things. And then you think about the general purpose technologies. General purpose technologies are the things that underpin everything else. They're the things that often government invests in over periods of time to make sure that they're across the economy in various shapes and forms. In our context, they're ICTs, so information technologies. Energy is another one, because energy often doesn't get mentioned. I know from personal experience, having built and run a supercomputer, they're the ones that gets, we'll just run that in the budget bottom line somewhere, and no one mentions it till you look at the cost and you think, my God, what the hell? Can't we do this better? So energy is going to be, something we need to think about. The last one I would mention is organisation, because how we think about organising, exactly the point I'm talking about now, is the sort of thing that's going to shape those things. And it comes down to things like financial instruments, production systems, means of productions, etc. So once we start thinking about that, it gives us a way of prioritising about which areas we're going to do, and then you need to make sure that they have feedback loops in between them, because you'll start learning across the basis. The second thing is models of working. So again, Michelle talked about alignment, sort of identifying different areas that we, where the strengths and weaknesses are. When you read the AUKUS documents and when you read particular material from defence, there is a lot of language there around integration. And it's just something that Dale mentioned before, actually on the field's integration. Interchangeability. It used to be interoperability when I first worked in defence. We're moving that area, then it became interchangeability. What you're talking about there in terms of levels of technology, understanding, sophistication is something very, very different. Because in one area, developing deep skills, but they're going to be, they can talk to each other. The other is swap in, swap out, you know, go plug and play, interchangeable. You're expecting everything to be up to a particular level. I think we have to think quite hard about this, because I want to find a way that we can actually encourage Australian industry, society and the economy to step up. We have to do a lot of the heavy lifting as well. If we do the integration path, we just get pulled along. We don't actually have terribly much say, because a lot of this integration is fitting in with the broader US posture, which personally I don't have too much of a problem about, because our interests are aligned. But there are going to be areas, particularly when we talk about technology, that's going to be in the civilian area, that we want to say, actually, we're really good at this and we should try and find the benefits of making sure we can work you know, where our interests lie, where our capabilities lie, and they complement each other. The other thing we need to think about is that difference between concentration, competition and diversity. The big model of technology with those big systems was a concentration model, very much a Schumpeter model. Then you have the competition model, which is very much a Silicon Valley, that dynamism that drives competition. Milan, you know, Michael Porter wrote case studies around what, you know, the fashion industry and ceramics industry in Milan, for example. You have those different, and you can build that ecosystem quite fast because you've got many different things around it. It's very dynamic. And then you have a diversity model where you're looking to get ideas in from different areas. It's looking at the adjacent possible and what's possible. Each of these lend themselves to different ways about integration and about whether they're use cases or frontiers, etc. But they're going to require different ways of organising the technology. They're going to require flexibility in the system, so they're not going to be standardised to one bureaucratic way of doing things. They're going to be sort of related to what's available in the particular areas. I mean, what's available in South Australia is quite different to what's available in Silicon Valley, to what's available in the northeast of the US, for example. Then you've got the ways of working. So again, this lies up with different realisation about how you realise technology, but there's a body of work there around the foundations. This comes back to things such as capability building, your education systems. It's institution building, so things such as James Patterson was mentioned before about parliamentary committees, but it's also about standards. If we can get standards right, for example, we can start building a lot more of that integration between AUKUS partners, but we can also, standards are the things which shape the world in technology. If we want to retain that competitive edge of particular technologies, we should be in there writing the standards and making sure that those are applied. And the last is that ecosystem, which I mentioned before, is and it's that supply chains as well as you know, things like the rare earth, etc. How we can bring those together. But we need an integrated view of these. At the moment, a lot of this is quite ad hoc. That takes me to the last point, which is around organisation. I have this phrase which I often use, which is organisation as weapon, which is just needs to recognise this can be a force multiplier in and of itself. When we've seen this, I think Peter before mentioned DARPA, for example. DARPA is a body that, you know, you could that came at a certain time and place, but it leveraged and was able to create this wellspring of technology that the United States has lived off and elsewhere in the world for quite some time. There are things around the place, if you can get the organisation structure right, you can actually do a lot more than would otherwise be available through current structures. And that's why I argue that you need to actually take a lot of these things outside the walls of defence and out from within the deep well of intelligence. There is good work done in that world. I've no doubt it will never see the light of day unless it's actually brought outside and we can actually transfer or bring it outside, or more importantly, develop it outside and let, you know, things come back in. And that's something I tried to do a few years ago at a small technology accelerator, where the idea was you just get together a PhD, you know, postdoc, a couple of engineers, a client from within the national security community, and you just smash together in a sprint. Can this work? Does it have legs? Can we apply it to this problem? If great. If it does, then, you know, my client from the intelligence world would just take it, and we could say, right, now we think this is a commercial and viable product. So that's the sort of dynamism we'd be looking for. You cannot do that in existing organisation, bureaucratic structures. It doesn't work. You've got to take this outside, It can straddle the interface, but it's got to be out there. So I'd be arguing for something like that's a coordinating authority. It's got deep tech expertise. It's decentralised. It has a light touch to a lot of these things. It can do that translation job, and that translation job works three ways: with allies and partners, with the private sector and academia, with decision makers, with technology into defence capability, and actually help facilitate that. And provides, and will need top cover. So I think I will probably end that way and take from questions, but I would say that I think the challenge of overcoming that divergent purpose, it is still early days. There is a lot of white space in the AUKUS agreement. I worry that that white space and what's there does not provide sufficient bracing to support the weight of expectations, and certainly of itself, the weight of a submarine project. I agree that the submarine project's long-term. I worry that if that runs into problems, which it is inevitable, that the rest will come down, take the rest down with it. So the more that, opportunity we can actually put money to this, we can put a structure around this, we can build the institutions and capabilities, the more likely we're going to realise the benefits of AUKUS. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. Thank you very much for those two very interesting sets of remarks. I'm going to throw it straight to the floor and see if anyone's got any questions yet. Just if we could get a microphone. I think one is on the. I can pass you one of these. Yeah, one's on the way. Okay, we've got a question here.
Hi, I'm Ed Obbard from UNSW Sydney. So the speakers have given us some great ideas and fantastic principles like FFRDCs and how technology needs to be developed in the civilian side as well as military, how industry and society need to step up, how education, capacity building, standards and supply chains are all super important, right? So just to sort of bring things sort of more tangible, let's just throw out on the table, say, nuclear fission reactor naval propulsion. And could you just sort of play with that idea a bit and maybe contextualize some of the things you were saying, using that as an example for how we might get to a technologically sort of innovating and leading position in Australia?
Well, I'll give you perspective as a nuclear submarine trained officer. I'm not sure there's a lot of innovation in building the reactor power plant and the drivetrain. I mean, it really is. It does exist. Naval reactors in the U.S. has been, and with BNFL and Rolls-Royce in the UK have been building these things for years. A lot of expense if you're going to try and design one of those systems from the ground up and try to put something new into it. My combination is that is not really what an example where a lot of innovation is required. That's really a lot of engineering and building the infrastructure. If the Australians want to be able to build those things themselves and put them together, then that's an infrastructure investment and getting that technology. When the UK got that technology, Admiral Rickover went over to the United Kingdom. He went and visited all the engineering and manufacturing companies. He worked with the specific ones that he felt had the quality control and the engineering to be able to build one of these things and operate it safely, and transferred the technology. It really wasn't, I mean, it was obviously more complicated than that, but in a simple way, that's how it worked.
Yeah, I tend to agree with it. That particular example is one where we probably effectively lift and shift. I think the concern there for me about the proposal for nuclear propulsion submarines is I would have expected to see a much larger cohort be shipped immediately to the United States for training. I'd be putting people into every school, whether it's Michigan, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, wherever, to start getting that training and bring it back here. I'd be looking to see, potentially a lot more, and I don't know what's been happening, I will admit that, about potential for the maintenance, support, what's required. I've got no doubt that that's all been done at the moment by Defence, but I think my initial concern was, again, where is the people side of this? What's happening in terms of building up nuclear physics labs, etc., in Australia? I think we've got ANU, a couple of others. Yeah, that would be my initial thoughts around that. It's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but again, I have to admit, I've been largely thinking about the nuclear issue as being, let's put that over there. I'm more interested in how we develop these other areas.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, hi, Paul Madison from UNSW. Not really a question, but I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying, Lesley, maybe provide a bit of a response to your question about education. So at UNSW, like ANU, we've been talking to the Nuclear Propelled Submarine Task Force for over 12 months. Dr. Obard leads our nuclear engineering postgraduate program, and we have been working with Navy, moving sailors and civilians through that master's program, preparing nuclear physics, chemistry, and maths upskilling, so that Australians going to nuclear power school in the U.S. will have that base necessary to succeed. I understand that every U.S. boat that's sailing out of Pearl Harbor these days has Australians on board. And I think when we see the AUKUS interim report, or whatever it's called, that's going to be tabled to government in March, we will see that campaign plan, which includes a line of operation, which is education and people and HR, that has a trajectory that ends with that first high readiness SSN sailing with a trained crew under Australian command and going north, it's sometime in the 2030s.
Oh, that's good to hear. I would ask then, to what degree, I mean, that's on the military side. Are we seeing a similar uptake on the civilian side as well?
So Ed might want to answer that as well, because he's very active in the nuclear skilling and industry space. Ed, did you want to say a word?
Well, thanks. Well, on the civilian side, it's hard to talk about, isn't it? Because it was explicitly ruled out of AUKUS by the government. So we're not meant to be doing the civilian side. But of energy, But okay, on the civilian side about people working in relevant industries, upskilling and so on, yeah. We have a group called the Nuclear Skills Forum in which companies can join and be exposed to more sort of familiarity with nuclear technology and finding out about how they can join supply chains. Because, originally we thought we wouldn't worry about Australian politics because there's actually an export opportunity for Australian advanced manufacturing, regardless of even AUKUS, in fact. But now AUKUS is here, there's also a domestic opportunity for advanced manufacturing in nuclear technologies. So we're doing everything we can to upskill Australian industry from big players to smaller SMEs. We've started in the New South Wales region, and hopefully we're going kind of national scale as soon as we can. There's lots more to say. I'll just stop. Love anyone to talk to me about it afterwards.
Thank you. My question is about innovation and the interface between that and some of the work that's going on with micro-credentialing. We have a panel of academics here. Traditionally, people associate innovation with higher education research, but of course a lot of innovation happens on the job and doesn't necessarily, it's this dichotomy between qualifications and skills. And one of the things that we're looking at as a nation is micro-credentialing and separating out qualifications and skills and the funding associated with those. Is there a way to harness the innovation potential which exists outside the traditional tertiary sector?
I am considerably biased in this regard because my answer is yes, because I developed a micro-credentialing degree. And the reason for doing so was precisely because I wanted to move away from this idea that you just do a degree and that's it for life. I'd actually really think we need to move to if we want to sort of lift our capability in Australia, you might even think about moving to a system whereby 1 day a week you're doing something, new learning in some way. It might be in the workplace, although again, I know from experience that, when people say, oh, you'll just learn on the job, sometimes that is, it doesn't mean anything. And micro-credentials offers a way for that to be recognised. And once it's recognised, it can be put into, workplace agreements or whatever. So I'm all in favour of having something like that, but it's got to actually mean something. Now, how do we actually, part of the reason it takes so long in the Australian system to get these things up is because you've got to get, any credential degree through the TEXA process, etc. And that is exceptionally, very rigid. There's good, it's got upsides, but it's got some downsides as well. The rigidity in it and the lack of flexibility to adapt to new systems, like, micro-credentialing is one. So there needs to be some sort of, whether it's a industry recognition or, industry group recognition about, yes, this is actually worthwhile doing, this gives you this particular skills, it'd be great. But anything that moves us to a system whereby we're picking up new skills, new understandings, we can start stacking the micro-credentials to actually get some, broader recognition would be great. I know that in the ICT field, because things are moving so fast that, if I took on some, software engineers, hardware engineers, and I said, okay, I'll take you on, but you're not going to get any training, they would actually get up and go. They know the need to actually keep their skills up to date. So the more we offer that, I think the better off we're going to be as well.
I know I'm not one of the speakers, but that kind of is my job. The micro-credentialing is something that King's and I think probably the wider Plus Alliance is very interested in developing and taking forward. But as Lesley said, it's got to be for some purpose. And I think that's one of the sort of issues with micro-credentialing is that it could be, the product at the end of it could be just a gelatinous mass, which makes no educational sense. So there has to be some sort of coherence imposed upon it. I think that's one of the areas that we're trying to develop a flexible response to, so that we can be more agile in that sector. As an example, and this is not part of the Plus Alliance, but King's is developing a micro-credential course called Professional Development, and that is a broad sweep of modules and courses and a recognition of prior learning and micro-credentialing from across the university. But at the same time, it needs to be focused on a particular set of skills and learning objectives in order to achieve something at the end of it which makes sense on to whether it's employers or to educational institutions. So there are a number of I think valid impediments to it, but it's possible to overcome those and to work in a way to develop those systems. Does that make sense? Yeah, good. I'm not just talking nonsense in a jet-lagged haze. Okay, we've got unless you've got you want to come back, right? I think we've got a question.
Hi, my name is Paul Senos. I'm from OSINT Combine, a startup based out of Sydney, and one of those that Joe Hockey was talking about that's actually, after 3 years, across inside all of the Five Eyes. So lucky for us, and bootstrapped the entire thing. One of the things I found down here, and I was talking to Michelle about it, is that the tall poppy syndrome is still very strong. How do we focus on building entrepreneurship within Australia, within the Australian community, so we have those startups that then Joe can go out and fund and grow, and what is the universities doing to foment that entrepreneurship?
Certainly, yes, I tend to agree. I mean, the tall poppy syndrome is in play. People don't like it when you get ahead. I've spoken to some expats I work with, people from the US and UK who've, corporate Sydney, who said to me one day, you know, they were just frustrated. They couldn't get their teams to stand up and be individualistic in the way that they'd expected, you know, their experience was in the US. And I told them to go away and read The Lucky Country. The dynamic here is quite different. I mean, it's very much, you know your place, just don't make waves, sit back, etc. Once they sort of they went away, read that, and said, right, now we get it. So I said, the way you motivate people is say, you know, basically do it on a team basis. So your team will get ahead. You know, this is going to help you and your friends, etc. And they sort of, you know, start using that. How you actually get into entrepreneurship inside Australian universities. Look, the universities themselves have got a whole range of opportunities there, and I think at some point, you know, it's up to some, you know, some students will naturally gravitate towards those. And I think the trick is partly identifying those, picking them up. So things like hackathons, there's various startup, boot camps and so on that universities will run. We were looking at, master's students, because master's students are sort of trying to do projects that are often, you know, very focused industry based. But also you'll find, the bright PhD or postdoc who's got some idea, but they don't quite know how to get out. Sometimes they don't know the language, don't know the ecosystem or the opportunities available to them. So sometimes it's just a matter of giving those opportunities. The academic career ladder, however, you know, they're often, you know, the bright ones are often encouraged to become more an academic, write more papers, etc. I think if we start saying, actually, if you can get out there and, you know, take the Stanford model whereby actually you'll get as much kudos as, you know, writing papers by going and giving this a go. And if you fail, you fail. You know, now's a great time to try. When you're young, it doesn't really matter that much you're learning, but come back and pick them up, etc. I'll say one other thing too. I know when I was in academia, I'd hear stories about people going, you know, some of these researchers going off, and they'd go off to, say, China because China had the capability. You know, they'd have the infrastructure, they had the latest technology. They'd go and work in the labs. There's lots of money. You know, you heard Michelle talking about the $900 billion program devoted to quantum. But frankly, they would get sick of it because they didn't like the culture, they didn't like the censorship, etc., and they come back. These people do come back, but we seem to lose them. I don't know where they go. So, you know, finding these sort of people and so on as well, because that's how China's been picking up a lot of this IP. They basically, you know, send people to universities in Australia, in the US, in the UK, in Europe. They get those ideas. They get the know-how, the headspace, because it's not just the intellectual content. It's actually knowing how to put these things together, and they'll go back to China. We need to do the same sort of thing, you know, find these people who've tried these and bring them back and give them those opportunities. One final thought though, and I think that the question about entrepreneurship starts at a much earlier age as well. So our schooling system basically produces people with the idea of you slot into a job. You know, the Tech Council recently produced something that Hedge Husick got up and said, you know, we need 40,000 tech jobs or 500,000, whatever the number was. What annoyed me about the language was it was tech workers. It wasn't tech business. It wasn't tech entrepreneurism. It wasn't about sort of setting up small business to sort of drive the economy, and small business does drive the economy. It was about tech workers, you know, click workers. And that I think is just the wrong language and the wrong approach. So there's issues all the way down the stack, you know, beyond the turtles.
So I'd add to that, you mentioned hackathons. If you heard of the Common Mission Project out of Stanford, they started off as Hacking for Defense, which is using lean startup theory to try and unearth solutions to common problems which have been proved intractable. So trying to incorporate and develop some entrepreneurial spirit within the student body. That has been wildly successful in the UK for us. We use that on an annual basis in a variety of contexts. Internship modules as well. So I don't know if this is a thing in UNSW or ASU, but it is good. So students are placed with companies, I guess, like yours, and over the course of 6 months or whatever, they complete a learning journal which fulfills the learning objectives of a module, and as a result develop that entrepreneurial understanding. So there are a variety of ways in which that's happening, but there's always room for expansion and development, right?
Also, one thing, but just about hackathons, it used to amuse me that on some of the cyber and tech hackathons, the most active students were not students from engineering, they were the lawyers.
It's because the arts and humanities and social sciences don't get to do that very often. It's very exciting. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Jim Crusoe, CSIS. I understand this is MITRE's first office outside the U.S.? And if that's so, why are you here?
Well, I was asked to come and talk about the FFRDC model, and MITRE is opening an office here in a couple of weeks. MITRE has offices at all the combatant commands, so they are overseas, but they're not necessarily. I don't think we have any we have an office in London, but it's more people supporting the NATO mission that's associated with London, and so we don't have this will be a unique, all sort of by itself office that they're standing up here.
Is AUKUS related?
Not necessarily, because it's more focused on trying to bring support directly to all aspects of the Australian government who's interested in trying to take advantage of the FFRDC model for the systems engineering technical expertise to help them make better decisions. It really is about being able to mitigate the risk, having somebody who is doing things in the public interest, in support of the government, on behalf of the government, who has the real technical expertise that exists in the commercial world, where often the government struggles to hire people with that strong technical expertise and experience in many of the areas in which MITRE works. When I used to come here when I was the director of S&T and tour the labs and work with DSTG, and my comment would be is for the things that the Australians invested in, they were outstanding. I mean, really, and we used to collaborate a lot with them and across the services, but the breadth and scope of things they invested in was what they could afford to do and the things that they were interested in. There's lots of things with this very complex fight of the future where there are opportunities to take advantage of an FFRDC-like capability to augment that knowledge to help make better decisions in terms of understanding what the most important gaps are and how to prioritize the work to get after closing those gaps, and then to help work some of these integration issues across the coalition fight, which will be incredibly important in the future.
Hi, thank you very much. I would like to go back to the question about the people side of tech development and innovation, and that also relates to entrepreneurship and industry and how to capitalize on people. So one challenge is that Australia is facing currently, and I think it's the same elsewhere as well, is this workforce shortage, especially in tech and especially in advanced technology. And it seems to me that one thing that Australia does very well, Australian universities do very well, is attract foreign brains to come here and study as international students, in the tertiary sector. But what we don't do well then is how to incentivize them to then go out and work in industry in Australia. And one big problem in advanced tech and cyber is that it's often related to defense, which means that as internationals, you're not allowed to work then in industry, or you're not allowed to then contribute to the defense sector. And so is this part of the conversation? Is there a conversation about how do we then retain that brain knowledge that we attract so well? And how can we then create opportunities for internationals here in Australia to go into the workforce and contribute to industry and innovation? And how can we break those barriers in terms of opportunities?
Yeah, I think a lot of the difficulty in retaining students has to do with visa issues and intake, etc. So I think that needs to be, frankly, broken and re-stitched together. I think in terms of, there will always be problems while they're not, Australian citizens to be able to work in the defence sector. That's always going to be a problem. And part of the reason I say we need to deconflict or sort of, separate out tech development from the translation to military capability is precisely, is part of it is to realise commercial opportunity, because a lot of these technologies are, civilian, based in the civilian. I mean, the hypersonic, hypersonics was developed at the University of Queensland, for example, which is, hardly qualified as a defence facility, and that was picked up later by the US Defence Department. So there's lots of opportunities there if we start deconflicting and sort of saying, here is the opportunity to build the tech base. By the way, at some point it will translate into the defence, at some point it will translate into military capability. I think as soon as you start saying we're just going to develop behind the closed walls and in the deep wells, then you're going to inherently limit a lot of those opportunities, both in terms of getting the people we need, in terms of the finance we can attract, in terms of the markets we can develop, in terms of the industry we can do. And a good example of that is, again, going back to, even the Collins-class submarine, where I remember being around when Paul Keating was talking about this would build Australian industry. He wanted the Australian, Phillips, the Dutch company Philips, he wanted that conglomerate. And precisely because it was kept behind, you can't do this, etc. The government of South Australia may beg to differ with me on this because, it helps prop up their economy. But really, we didn't realise, their level of expectation that was laid on the submarines. And that's in part my fear with AUKUS as well, is, we need to build the bracing around it to be able to sustain the weight of expectation, to build the track record, etc. It's going to be, the pressure will be to get this thing here and now, but it's going to take time. Some of these things take a long time. You cannot, train and season an engineer in really logically anything much less than about 5, 6, 7 years. So some of this is just time bound, and the more we sit there and wait and admire the problem, the longer it's going, it's going to take to get there.
So let me add a few thoughts on that, because we have the same issue. It's huge. And the challenge is we really need to think differently about the visa issue and about how to create a path to citizenship if those students want to stay and want to get into this industry, and creating paths to do that. Because there is a lot of brain power that goes back offshore when they want to stay but can't, they want to contribute but can't, because they recognize that the tremendous opportunities that exist to advance their career, to participate, to make a difference, and they want to stay. And so we've got to figure out how to do this. And it kind of gets along the same idea, this AUKUS thing, and all of the ITAR discussions that went on earlier today. We collectively, the three nations, need to figure out that the protection of information is important, but frankly, the lack of sharing of the information is going to lead to a defeat on the battlefield, because that is the real risk. The real risk is, how do I make sure I win if I have to? How do I create a military capability in a coalition that says to anybody that, maybe I'm going to not pursue some sort of kinetic action, the deterrence idea, because I recognize there is strength and capability to stop me, and there's a will to do so if I cross some kind of line. Right now, we're more worried about the eaches instead of the big picture, and it's something we've got to figure out. And I applaud the last speaker who talked about this idea of some sort of a legislator caucus between the three nations, because that's where it's going to have to get. They're going to have to change the laws and the regulations. They're going to have to come up with a different system. They're going to have to give more trust to the military who are working these individual things and what things need to be shared in order to create that real coalition.
Avoid shouting. Okay, thank you very much. I think it might be time to draw stumps. Thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion, and for the questions from the audience as well. Please join with me in thanking our speakers.